So thank you everybody for coming back once again, continuing these Tuesday Philly freelance focus sessions as we have for the last couple of months. Today we want to do something a little bit different. We've got a different kind of topic, a different kind of expert, and obviously a different time of day. So joining us today is Tony Lopes. As Lisa pointed out in the chat room, if you came to the Philly Freelance Fest back in January, all the way back in January, you may have had a chance to meet Tony. He was part of a group of experts who shared with attendees, ran sort of like a legal expertise office hours for our community there. And Tony's been a friend and a supporter of our community all this time. And has been really, really active and enthusiastic about sharing his knowledge as a lawyer and an entrepreneur with this community. So I'm excited to have him back. Thanks for being here, Tony. As always, I'm joined by my partner in crime, Catherine Sontag. Is going to be running things behind the scenes. She's letting everybody in as they come in. Also going to be helping keep an eye on the chat room. Speaking of the chat room, before we dive into things with Tony, I know he's got a bit of a presentation to kick things off, just to set a little bit of context, give you a little bit of background on him and his areas of expertise. But this is also meant to be sort of conversational Q&A. So if you came with questions, awesome. If you're thinking about questions, awesome. Jot those down. You'll be able to jot those down in the text-based chat room and share those, and we'll have a little sort of interactive Q&A dialogue coming up in just a couple of minutes. And I will mention that while we are recording the first portion of this, while Tony's sort of giving his presentation, we're going to turn the recording off for those questions. So you don't have to worry about asking a question, that showing up on a recording somewhere else on the internet. We're not going to put you through that. So all that's going to happen just for the folks here in the room, since you were cool enough to show up. With all of that out of the way, thrilled to introduce all of you who have not met Tony yet to Tony Lopes. How you doing today, Tony?
Hey, Alex. Thanks, man. Yeah, this is great. Love collaborating with Indy Hall. We actually run our firm out of Indy Hall, and as I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a little bit, we also record some podcasts there. So love Indy Hall, love the community there. Huge fan of that space and of Alex in general and everything that he does. And even more so post COVID-19 crisis, with all the support and information that Alex and Indy Hall have provided for us. So it's been huge, even for myself and a lot of my clients tangentially. So yeah, Alex, thank you so much for having me. Can I present, Alex? Can I share a screen?
You absolutely can. The screen is
Cool.
yours.
Great, thanks. All right, so I will just share a PowerPoint presentation. Sorry for the old school nature of that, I guess, but can everyone see my PowerPoint? All good? Yeah. I won't run it in presentation mode only because it makes my MacBook go all crazy. So we'll just run it this way if nobody minds. But so I'm Tony Lopes. I run my own firm called Lopes Law LLC. Not exactly the most clever name on the planet, certainly, but it's pretty evocative of, of what we do. We're lawyers. So we do have a team in place as well, and we are here certainly to support you. And for the most part, one of the things we pride ourselves on is very similar in fashion to what Indy Hall does, is being more of a collaborative service rather than a service that sends you surprise bills every month for, you know, phone calls, emails, that kind of thing. So we try to collaborate as much as possible. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to call us. We're not going to send you any surprise bills. We would warn you if you were towing the line of needing more substantive or actual legal assistance, or try to help point you in the right direction. But a lot of times we're here to just have a quick discussion if you have something going on your mind, much like this. What do we practice in? Mainly contracts. We do some negotiations, tax law, some estate planning, intellectual property, M&A, mergers and acquisitions, some franchise law, some employment stuff, and some nonprofit law as well. Basically everything that an entrepreneur, solopreneur, whatever label you want to put on it, modern business person needs in today's world. I'm also the founder and host of the Self-Made Strategies podcast, which, as I said, we record at Indy Hall very frequently. Alex was actually a guest on my podcast and was an awesome episode, so go back and check that out if you're interested. Self-Made Strategies, 3 words, on iHeart, Apple, Google, or on our website, selfmadestrategies.com, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts, pretty much. I also teach at Temple. I started teaching this past spring semester, which has been a huge blessing, super rewarding, just working with undergrads at the Fox Business School. I went to Fox, so kind of surreal, but totally awesome to be up on the lectern now instead of in the seats. But I now empathize with all my professors from having to put up with me and administering exams and stuff like that. But it's been super cool, and especially with all that's been going on with all of this uncertainty, it's just been nice to have that as well in my life. Teach law, legal and environment of business, which is basically intro to business law, and environmental law to Fox Business undergrads. So pretty cool experience that I've had recently. Just a quick disclaimer, I'll give you the short version. Go back and read this if you really need this, but use your common sense. This isn't legal advice. Indy Hall is not responsible. We're not responsible for making any warranties or representations. But if you do need legal help, either reach out to another attorney or just shoot us a quick email, call, text, find us on Instagram. There are a million different ways that you can contact me, and would be happy to answer any quick questions that you have or anything like that. But this webinar itself is not per se legal advice. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today at a high level? Well, for the most part, we're going to talk about contracts in general. This is similar to what we did at Freelance Fest. So Lisa, great to see you. And my here that we're now talking about what to do with respect to COVID with all of our business agreements, right? And we'll talk about it at a high level. I'll try not to bore you too much with the legalese, but just know that you do have options, and that personally, I consider these opportunities for collaboration, relationship building. And so even if you're going through a stressful time period, I think it's important to focus on what our long-term outcomes are and how we can set ourselves up foundationally for that going forward. But basically, there are such things as collaboration agreements, and now would be a great time to consider who can I collaborate or work together with, especially if they have overflow work. Some people, I had a call from a colleague the other day that said he's overwhelmed with client work, and we said, hey, we're willing to help, or kind of put our team in place. So there are people out there who are still pretty fortunate in the context of having some work flowing in, and you want to be in a position where you can build some strategic collaboration with those individuals, and it helps you to build stronger relationships with your stakeholders as well. And when I say stakeholders for the rest of this presentation, I generally mean anyone who's tangentially involved in your business. So that's your own team, that's your competitors, that's your community, that's Indy Hall, that's your family, that's your friends, your spouse, your dogs, your cats, etc. Basically, anybody who has any tangential relationship to your business or to the industry that you're in would be a stakeholder. But this is actually a really great opportunity to look to those, even your competitors, and say, hey, what are you doing during COVID-19? And here's what we're doing, an idea share, and come up with unique solutions that work for your industry or for your business or for your competitor's business, because you really never know, even with quote unquote competitors, you never really know when there's going to be opportunities where they have overflow work, as I said, or where maybe you have overflow work, and it helps you to kind of fortify that relationship. So a couple of the things, of course, being a lawyer, to protect yourself with is look at local laws in terms of like antitrust issues and stuff like that. I don't think anybody on this particular call is going to have one of those issues, but just kind of make an assessment about whether or not there's anything that you need to look out for legally when you're getting involved with somebody else in a collaboration. You might want to consider a non-disclosure agreement, although I caution that because the importance of an NDA, especially in a smaller business collaboration, is not really that critical. And also you can save a lot of time, money, and effort just by doing a collaboration agreement overall that includes some of those things. You might want to start considering some force majeure clauses, which is what we'll focus on in a bit here going forward. And what those are just in layman's terms, act of God kind of clauses, right? So what happens if something like COVID-19 happens and we can't continue on with our business and continue to deliver? And again, a stakeholder might be a vendor, a stakeholder might be a longtime client. So having these provisions in there strategically structured such that if, both parties basically have outs, and it's fair for everybody, and we're really thinking contextually about how to preserve the relationship more so than any one real singular transaction. I'm a little nuanced in the context that I really, first of all, pride myself in not being your average lawyer. That would be like the worst thing that anybody could call me. It would be a typical lawyer probably. But that aside, we do really focus a lot on being more collaborative and avoiding litigation or conflict as much as possible. And look, we're all humans. We all make mistakes, but I see a lot of mistakes being made just because people don't think forward enough and also don't think contextually about the other party and the perspectives that are involved in all of these things. So, that's something to think about with your lawyer and to discuss with your lawyer. There's also these new agreements that are starting to pop up called standstill agreements, and we'll touch on them in a little bit. There was a Temple Law professor that, in collaboration with a few other attorneys, drafted what they called the ABA, the American Bar Association, model standstill agreement. I personally have a lot of criticisms about it. I know they're trying to cover a lot of bases and provide some support to the community, but at the same time, when you try to do a catch-all, it tends to not really solve anyone's problem and just create more ambiguity. So, a little bit of caution there as well in terms of downloading templated agreements. Is not the time to try to skim on legal fees by, Googling and saying, oh, I can find a collaboration agreement. We can do this ourselves. A quick call, with an attorney. By the way, Alex, if I stumble, my internet connection sometimes can be a little funky. So just give me a heads up if something gets missed. Sorry. But just very important to think, I think, at a high level about the risks versus rewards. And as I said, with our firm, I can only speak about us. I know lawyers have a tendency to overcharge in a lot of instances and stuff like that. Have those discussions up front if you're working with another attorney about what is this going to cost to draft a standstill agreement or a collaboration agreement or add some clauses to my agreements or that kind of thing. Just try to get some transparency up front and that don't get that number. We see a lot of the stuff that we do, in part because I don't like billable hours for a lot of reasons. I don't think it's aligned with client goals. I don't think it's aligned with better outcomes and deliverables for people. But just have those discussions. And I would caution you not to download an agreement and use a templated agreement. I actually have a client who, it wasn't my client that did this, but they're in negotiations with somebody else. And we get this operating agreement and I had the discussion with my client about reviewing it and how much it was going to cost and all those things. And we went back and forth and we figured out a budget that worked for us, and we get the agreement and I start reviewing it and I realized at the bottom of it, it said lawdepot.com or something like that. It was a templated operating agreement for a joint venture that was a complete disaster. I ended up, about a fifth into the agreement, just deleting the whole thing and drafting from scratch because it was just that bad. So don't do those things. There's a lot of legal risk. And I have another client who's having an argument with a partner and, they're figuring out how to negotiate. I'm trying to mediate the situation, and their existing operating agreement is missing a lot of stuff without saying who my clients are. And that's an issue. That's a problem. And it causes lots of ambiguity. It causes a lot of stress. It costs you more money in the long run. So don't do that to yourself. Okay, so generally speaking, contracting COVID-19, where are we? What are we looking at? We'll talk a little bit about master service agreements. This is something we talked about at the Freelancer Fest. We'll talk about amendments, modifications, and new agreements, the differences, and at a high level, what you should choose. We'll drill down on force majeure clauses, as I promised. And then we'll talk a little bit about, negotiations opportunities, why you should be thinking ahead, what happens after the new normal, some of the stuff that you should be thinking about. We'll take a quick moment on the ABA standstill agreement. And I think I might skip the unemployment compensation law. It's really just an example more so. I'll just touch on it now. That the laws are changing, as we know. And Indy Hall has been very supportive, I think, in terms of trying to provide transparency. but quite frankly, it's fairly apparent that everyone is struggling to come up with answers, and things are changing on a day-to-day basis. So as I said at the beginning, with antitrust laws, I think those are a little bit higher level than we really need to discuss, but stuff like the unemployment compensation law, which has changed very drastically over the last month, could have effects on you and your business. And if you have employees and stuff like that, could have effects on that as well. So just kind of keep an eye on those things as you're going forward. All right, master services agreements. So master service agreements are agreements that you would use, and hopefully you would only have it drafted maybe once or doesn't need to constantly be drafted. And it's kind of to cover those situations when you're constantly, doing the same thing, like you're delivering a service to a client, whether you're a freelancer or a company or whatever you're doing, whatever service or product you deliver, it's that agreement that you use to initiate that discussion. And there are good ways to set that up as a pseudo template, for lack of a better term, for you to use going forward with some easy customizations to make, like adding statement of work or something like that, like an SOW to it, rather than having to redraft the agreement each time. Well, if you have one, keep in mind that it's legally binding and you may be bound to your clients despite what happens with a crisis like COVID-19. So now is kind of the time to maybe consider looking at those things. And if you don't have one, might be a good time to start implementing them, because there are unique ways to add in provisions. And I've seen a variety of different examples of using force majeure clauses, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to add some fail-safes to the agreement. Okay, so what happens if in a month from now we're still quarantined? Nobody freak out, hopefully not. But what happens if we get to that situation, we're still quarantined and we need to figure out what our next steps are, or can we continue to deliver? Are we struggling to meet client demands right now? And so just giving yourself some flexibility in that capacity might be a good idea. And so, adding those things into those agreements, updating those agreements going forward, and even, this has changed everything for us, right? For all of us in general. We're all going through this little bit of a spiral of craziness. Some of us are up, some of us are down, and then we switch places, I think. But what it's taught us is that we definitely don't know what we don't know, and that's pretty scary. So we need to start thinking proactively and contextually going forward. How do we protect ourselves and start being more collaborative? Community. So think about going forward. It's time to do a little bit of damage control without freaking out. Thinking about, talking to your stakeholders to say if they'd consider updating a master services agreement with you if you already have one in place. But I think you need to offer some added value there as well, right? We need to think in the context of, yeah, we're going through a crisis, but so are they. And there are multiple perspectives here. There's our perspective, certainly. There's their perspective, the second party, if you will. And then there's the we perspective, which is the collective of this pseudo entity of the relationship between us and how we keep that alive and prevent it from falling apart on us. So what happens if you can't deliver? So I always try to take two approaches at a minimum, to every discussion. And one is there's the legal all these things, right? Yeah, sued for civil liability for all the things that you see on the PowerPoint right now, for non-performance, for interference with another party's performance. So if you're a consultant, for instance, or let's say I saw a couple of graphic designers, I think, in the chat. So let's say you're a graphic designer and you're supposed to deliver a product to a client, and you can't right now for some reason. So therefore, that client can now not deliver their own product. So you're technically there's this cascading issue with, oh, sorry about that. What did we miss, Alex? Are we good? Was it contextually more or less okay?
You're good. Dropped out for a little bit, but I think we're getting the vast majority of it. You're good.
Cool. All right, great. Yeah, so, there are all of these issues to consider, and I don't want to browbeat you too much with this, certainly, and I'd like to keep this more upbeat than negative, especially since it's a 5 o'clock on a pseudo Monday. But just keep these things in mind that, yes, theoretically, all of these things are on the table, but I think there's always a solid discussion to be had, a solid argument to be made. that we're all going through this crisis. And if you're more transparent and try to head things off and just own them, and be open without damaging yourself or your relationship, you can head off a lot of these problems and avoid issues. So there's the academic side, as I said, with what's in the agreement, what are the remedies for non-performance and all those things. But there's also the practical real world aspect. And there are ways to get around these things strategically without allowing yourself to get burnt on the back end. So amendments, modifications, new agreements, what should you do? Really, it depends, right? First and foremost, just looking at amendments or modifications, it's basically the same thing, right? An amendment and a modification is really semantics about the structure or the wording of the agreement. But theoretically, if it's a properly drafted master services agreement or some contract that you have with somebody, it will have a provision governing, can we amend this thing? Usually you can. You just need a writing, meaning a written document signed by all the parties to the agreement, and you should be able to get around it. If you have those provisions in the existing documents or agreements that you're talking about, we can talk about opening up the discussion and then adding in these provisions to hopefully protect the relationship going forward, which is really, really what's valuable here, I think, to your business is all of those relationships that you've spent so much time building, and all of that relationship capital, if you will, is more important than any singular transaction. And so what we want to look at is how do we build structures to protect that versus just, I need this one transaction to make more money to stay afloat. So we need to, obviously you need money to stay afloat and to pay your bills, but we need to keep an open mind about what the long-term strategy is as well. In the context of new agreements, it also depends about what's in your existing agreement. Just because you draft a new agreement doesn't necessarily mean the old one goes away. So we need to look at the big picture. We need to look at the context. These are discussions you need to have, hopefully with an attorney that knows what they're doing. And these things need to be talked about contextually. So force majeure clauses, just at a high level, they're basically act of God clauses, as we said, and they're made to protect the events described in them. They're sometimes be called acts of God clause or force majeure literally or something along those lines. So don't worry so much about the labels or the Latin or the legalese. Worry more so about what the contextual language in the agreement is. And you may or may not, be able to modify the existing agreement. You may need a new agreement to overlap. And even if you can, is there already a force majeure clause in there? What does it say? What does it cover? Most likely doesn't cover COVID-19, quite frankly, if it was drafted before this. Some of the stuff I've seen can be a little bit on the dark side, and obviously that's just the way lawyering goes sometimes. The ones I have drafted for our clients have been very mutual because we're trying to take a very collaborative approach. We're trying to take the approach of, look, we care about you as much as we care about us in our business, and we want to keep this thing alive. So putting together a clause that considers both parties, but also encompasses, a pandemic and what a pandemic means in COVID-19 and what happens if this comes back and yada, 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 all of those things. And trying to be as inclusive, but at the same time collaborative as we can be. You find it pretty quickly. Again, caution, caveat, be careful about looking at this thing as more than just a starting point for a discussion. It may help save you on legal fees, right? If you're contacting an attorney and they're saying, hey, it's going to cost X to draft an agreement, you may be able to hand them this and say, can we start from this and kind of turn it into something that fits a little bit better. My personal perspective is no agreement should ever be a full template, right? You should have a starting point, certainly, and then kind of construct it from there. So that's one of my biggest criticisms with this. It's also very hyper-specific to COVID-19. So looking at long terms, the term of the agreement. What if this lasts another year with uncertainty? What if cover enough of a broad base, but is also overly broad at the same time. And again, this thing is just a model. So it's helpful as a guide, but it's very, very broad in coverage. So it probably doesn't fit your specific circumstances on its own. So that's one of the things I think you need to have care about and moving forward. Okay, so what about subcontractors? Because some of you on here might be subcontractors. Some of you may have subcontractors that work for you, or you may work in tandem with subcontractors. So hopefully, again, your subcontractor agreements are up to snuff, they're up to date. Want to look at the nature of the relationship in these contexts. I know there's a lot of uncertainty with unemployment and all of those things going on right now. So just because you're called a subcontractor doesn't necessarily mean you're not an employee. That can definitely be an issue. So you have to look at what the actual nature of the relationship is. The contract kind of doesn't matter in that respect because there's a federal 20-factor test. And if you meet the employee standard, you're an employee for federal purposes. So those are some of the issues that you have to look at. Subcontractors certainly have rights under those agreements. And same thing applies to what we were talking about. We need to look at, how this agreement functions in the real world now. You might want to have, again, your agreements reviewed by an attorney. You got to think about these things and look at the big picture. Okay, so this is really, at least for me, about negotiating, collaborating, and working on the relationship. So I think it's a good opportunity right now to reach out to some of your stakeholders, maybe especially those that you haven't talked to in a while, and use this as an opportunity to initiate more discussion, to open up negotiations, but be clear in your own mind that it's not necessarily about you or me, it's more so about us, right? It's how do we continue to fortify this relationship? How do we build solid relationship capital so that when we come out of this thing, people are thinking to themselves, wow, X person is a rock star. They were really proactive when we were dealing with COVID. I want to continue to work with them, or I want to support their business. And also keep in mind always from the other person's perspective, if you wouldn't take a deal that you're offering, right, why would they? And that's just a good way to think about things in general, kind of put yourself in the other party's shoes and try to think about this as a big inclusive sort of opportunity. And focus on building ROR, return on relationship. Get away from ROI. It's very transactional in nature. Of course, it's important to look at the numbers of your business and all of those things, but organizations are run by human beings. So you should think about how you leave them feeling about you and your business, but also think about the things that they're going through, right? We're all going through this craze with COVID-19 and we're all up and down at different times. So just be a little bit sensitive and empathetic to what's going on out there. And then cannot emphasize this enough. You want to be open with your communication and fairly transparent. Obviously, you need to be strategic. I'm not saying just, show your hand immediately, but you need to be concerned about your future, certainly, but you need to fortify these relationships because they're a big part of your past, all the time and effort that you put in to build them this far, but also your future going on to continuing to build your business. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background. One of the issues of working at home during COVID-19. I do encourage, and this is, I guess, the lawyer part of my brain kicking back in, that providing notice and getting things in writing is important, but it's also a two-sided coin. So don't use it as a weapon right now. Be strategic. You can certainly have discussions on the phone or over a Zoom call. If you're having it over a Zoom call, by the way, in Pennsylvania, this is a good opportunity to bring out something that's nuanced. PA is a two-party state, meaning that if you're recording a conversation, both parties have to consent to it. So if you are going to record a conversation, just make sure you get the other party's consent before you move forward. And obviously on Zoom, it's really easy at the beginning if you're recording to just say, hey, I'm going to record our conversation. Do you mind? And hopefully they'll say yes, and you're good. But focus on those things. Think about the relationship. Think about being collaborative. Avoid conflict as much as possible. You don't need any more stress in your life right now. Let's just get through this together. Let's stay focused, eye on the prize, and that's the best we can do. So that's my presentation. If you have questions, certainly. Oh, and please follow at Self-Made Strategies on Instagram and at Lopes Law LLC. That one's being a big time. If you have questions, go at lopesllc.com 267-777-9117, or a smoke signal in the direction of Manayunk will get you a response. The smoke signal, maybe not, but I was kidding about that. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to open up the discussion or chat about anything that's on your mind.
Unmute myself. First of all, well, thank you. Before we get into questions, if anybody else is on camera or wants to flip on camera and do a quick Zoom round of applause for Tony, this is the style that we do that around these parts. A little bit of spirit
Thank you,
fingers.
guys. Right back at you.
That was great. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. It's my favorite part of getting this group together every week. That was great. Super, some critical things for folks to be thinking about before we get into crowd questions, since folks might need a minute or two to put their questions in the chat room, which is where we're going to have folks put the questions. I'll read out your question. Tony will answer it. If your question is too long to type out in the chat room and you would rather either come on audio or video, you can use the raise hand feature, which you can find by clicking the participants button down below, and that'll show us that you want to come on camera and ask Tony the question directly. That's an option as well. While folks are typing out questions, actually before we do that, I'm going to stop recording as I promised.